fundamental analysis, the basis of fundamental analysis is supply and demand tables. And it's not to say that we don't use technical analysis. Technical analysis is very useful. It's very important. There's good chart signals that you can get and good indicators of momentum. And momentum will tell you whether or not you want to be acting on a really good opportunity if prices are overvalued by selling today, or if markets are undervalued against equilibrium supply and demand, where that would say prices should be at, then you want to wait with sales until the market catches up to where it should be. So we use technical analysis and fundamental analysis in tandem to time our sales. For the most part, we use the fundamentals to determine long-term trends. And then to say whether or not we want to front-end load sales of any crop in the given year, which means selling more off the combine, or making sure that we sell more before sort of that December-January window, when sometimes a lot of stuff can change. If other geographies are harvesting crops, that can create seasonal downturn in the winter. Or if you see on the supply and demand table that by the end of the coming year, carryout stocks are forecast to decrease, that would argue for a long-term uptrend. So we stretch out our supply and demand tables as long as we can. Generally speaking, in about September, we will create the column for the upcoming crop year. So in September of 2012, we formulated our estimates for the 2013-14 crop year. And that's really important because that's about the time when prices for the 2013 crop are starting to come available. That is definitely a time when a lot of farmers are starting to buy seed, starting to allocate acres for the upcoming season. So clients need to know, generally speaking, which crops represent a better opportunity and which crops represent a bigger risk in terms of price direction over the long run. So what is behind a supply and demand table? I mean, they can be pretty messy pages of lots of numbers that might just seem like a jumble, but there's actually quite a bit of order and sensibility to these things. Most of the cells on a supply and demand table are formulas, and so you enter StatsCan's figures for acres, our latest yield forecasts, and out spits production. Add on to that customs data on imports and the last StatsCan number for the carryout from the previous year, and you get total supply added up automatically. On a live basis throughout the course of the winter, we're adjusting our export numbers based on grain commission data that comes out every month. We estimate domestic and feed use, and all that totals into the total demand. Total supply less total demand equals the carryout. And again, those formulas help instill a lot of discipline into our opinion, into formulating an opinion about whether prices are going up and down, because we didn't just say, hey, it's not raining and the crop is going to be, smaller than we expected, therefore supplies will be tight and the price will go up. There's a lot more factors that come into that final calculation of the carryout, and by updating a supply and demand table with those specific pieces of data that you have, even though they might be just for a small region or for a small piece of the whole final outcome and of what goes into the carryout, by keeping these little pieces up to date and then using formulas to tell you what the outcome is, it takes a lot of the discipline out of your reaction to the short-term noise. On the demand side, that's another really interesting dynamic when it comes to Canadian crops. One thing about Western Canada, we grow a lot of crops here. There's probably 5 or 6 important pulses and special crops. And even in the cereals category, like feed barley and malt barley are not the same thing. CPS wheat and feed wheat and actually high quality spring wheat are the same thing this year, in a sense that the price is the same. But in a normal year, you've got spreads between all the different classes of wheat depending on what they're going to be used for. And those are quite variable. So there's not just sort of one market for wheat or one market for lentils. There's all these subcategories that are kind of moving targets. Anyway, that's one interesting thing about Western Canadian crops, is there's a lot of them. And in other geographies, you're just kind of growing and marketing soybeans, corn, and wheat. And the whole job of understanding supply and demand and the structure and the dynamics of each individual market, they're not as important to prices. But here, it's really quite a big job to stay on top of all these different markets that have unique factors that make them go higher and lower, and also a unique role in the world. So, in the last few years, going back to wheat as an example, we wouldn't have seen Canadian production matter as much to world supply and demand as maybe it did, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But at the same time, we've got these new crops, lentils, flax, durum, peas. They're not all necessarily new crops, but there's a good number of crops that have been pretty solid in terms of the acreage base that they command in Western Canada that matter a lot to world supply and demand. Canada is by far the biggest producer and exporter of all those crops that I just listed. And that has a big impact on prices. So what that ends up meaning then is if we see a challenge, a yield challenge in the main flax growing area, that market's going to respond. If you see a huge flood in southern Manitoba and it goes all the way across the province, that's going to crimp oat supplies, and that is really going to matter. I mean, of course, if there's a big carryout, then growing conditions, difficult growing conditions, are not going to matter that much because these supplies will be bigger to start out the year. But if like this year you got a tight carryout for flax and oats and peas, possibly durum as well, if we have problems in the growing region here, that could be very important to prices. If we have a huge crop, that is also important to prices, but going in the other direction, because now all of a sudden the world knows, okay, Saskatchewan got a big durum crop, I'm not going to have to pay up for it as much, and very little else matters in some of these markets besides what happens in Western Canada. So that, again, that's not the case in chickpeas, that's not the case in wheat anymore. It is very much the case in canola, but within this whole long list of crops that we're marketing here, the structure of supply, how much Canada matters to the world stage, tells you a whole bunch about demand. So what we do on the demand side is we look every month when the data comes out, which origins were buying, how much did they buy, where are they on pace for the year, and that becomes an important determinant to the medium-term price direction. And by that we usually mean between now and the end of the crop year.